It began with a chilling echo that no one would piece together until much later. January 31st in the year 2000. Jodie Foster, no, not that one, moved into a new home with her young daughter Hannah. It was to be a fresh start for the young mother, a small apartment in a complex in Chico, California. The place was ordinary enough, 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a balcony that overlooked a quiet street. Jodie could picture her daughter playing in the communal swimming pool as she got a little older. It was perfect for what the two of them needed. Well, it seemed perfect, when she initially viewed it at least. But on the day that she arrived with their belongings, Jodie felt weird. The home didn't feel peaceful. It felt dark. Jodie said she was overcome with anxiety, like something terrible was going to happen. But on the surface at least, there was nothing wrong, with the exception of one thing. A strange chemical smell that she hadn't noticed before. It started subtle, as these things always seem to. Jodie would keep Hannah's pink sneakers on the rack by the front door, but when they went to go out one morning, the shoes weren't there. Jodie searched and strangely found them on Hannah's bed, placed neatly together in the centre. It was odd, but Jodie assumed her daughter had just been messing around with them, but Hannah said she hadn't. Jodie likely wouldn't have thought twice about it, but then it happened again, and again. Then she would wake to find the salt and pepper shakers on the kitchen table had been pushed to the very edge, somewhere the 3-year-old Hannah could barely reach. Increasingly, other items would begin to move when no one was looking. Jodie wasn't sure what to make of it all, but then the dream started. For weeks, Jodie would experience them. They were different each time, but they seemed to always contain the same 3 people. 3 people she didn't recognise. A teenage girl who she would see walking down a street, and a couple in a blue-grey car. In one of the dreams, the couple called the young girl over. They offered her a ride, but then something happened. Jodie's dreams were confused. She would only partially remember the details in the morning, but more often than not, the feelings and distinct images would remain. She remembered the man getting out of the car and holding something over the girl's face. Then she passed out before the car drove away. One afternoon, Jodie was sitting in her kitchen when she heard Hannah talking. Hannah called out, "Hi." Initially thinking her daughter was calling her, Jodie went to go and see what she wanted, only to find Hannah standing in the hall, looking into her room. Something about the scene sent a chill down Jodie's spine. She slowly approached the doorway to find the room empty. Jodie asked Hannah who she was talking to. Hannah said, the girl who was standing in her room. It was just an imaginary friend. That's what Jodie kept telling herself. Hannah kept talking to the girl. She started calling her My Liz, a strange name, but kids can be weird. Then she started drawing her. A young girl in a white shirt and blue jeans. A girl that seemed familiar to Jodie. She might not have made the connection immediately, but the drawings looked a lot like the girl she was seeing in her dreams. The dreams that were still plaguing her every night. Those dreams had grown darker. The young girl now seemed to be in a basement, though Jodie said it felt more like a dungeon. She could see her, tied to a large hook. There was something around her face, but Jodie couldn't quite grasp what she was seeing. The couple were there too, and they were doing things to the girl. Jodie has never gone into the exact details of what she saw, but she described them as dark, sexual acts. Whatever it was Jodie was seeing in her dreams was genuinely beginning to disturb her. One day she returned home to find the apartment in a state of disarray. The phone on the wall had been pulled off and placed on the floor in one of the back rooms, its cord tied around it. Then when she stepped into Hannah's bedroom, she found all of her daughter's toys piled up in the centre of the room. At the top sat her Sesame Street doll. A shoelace had been tied around Ernie's neck, so that it resembled a noose. Jody rushed out of the apartment and called the police. Someone had clearly broken in, and there was no way that this could not be seen as a threat. But just a few nights later, she would come to realise that this was no break-in. Jody was awoken late at night by the sound of static. She walked into the living room to find the TV had been turned on. But as she rubbed the sleep out of her eyes trying to make sense of what was going on, she suddenly snapped into reality when she realised all the cupboard doors in the kitchen were flapping open and shut. The oven stove had been turned on, and that Ernie doll was sitting on the floor, repeating its pre-recorded sound bites over and over. Jody turned everything off, slammed the cupboard door shut and paused. Everything seemed to stop. Everything except the Ernie doll that was still talking. She picked it up, pulled out its batteries, threw it in a cupboard and went to walk away. But as she did, it started speaking again. As she slowly turned, every single light in the house suddenly switched on in unison. Jody grabbed her daughter and rushed to the manager's office, begging her to come and look and figure out what was going on in apartment 14. The manager picked up her little poodle dog and followed Jody back. The dog instantly started barking. Then the manager saw the light cord and one of the lamps was moving, spinning around like a skipping rope. She too quickly departed. Jody was sitting by the swimming pool as the sun began to break, her exhausted daughter laying in her arms. Jody was crying. She didn't understand what was happening or what she should do. As she was sitting there, she was approached by an elderly neighbour of hers who was walking his dog. He was just checking to see if she was okay. Jody didn't really explain much, but she tried to reassure the man that she was fine. But that's when he told her. Apartment 14 had quite a high turnover. No one lived there for long. In fact, he said, it had been that way since the 1970s, when the young girl who lived there went missing. After 3 months, Jody, worried for her daughter's safety, packed up her belongings and left. She tried to put the whole thing behind her. The activity stopped when they left, but after a year the dreams seemed to return. Still, she tried her best to ignore them. That was until years later. Jody was now living with a new boyfriend, and one day he came rushing to her excitedly. He had been reading a book about a young girl who had gone missing in the 70s from Chico. He couldn't believe it when he realised the apartment she had gone missing from was the one Jody had been living in a few years prior. Jody found a picture of the girl and took it to Hannah, who was now a little older. Jody showed her the picture and Hannah recognised her straight away. That was my Liz. That was the girl Hannah kept claiming to see in the apartment. Her real name was Marie Elizabeth Spanicky, or affectionately known as Marliz to her friends and family. She had indeed lived in that apartment, and her story was a tragic one. In January of 1976, a young woman named Mary Elizabeth Spanicky vanished from Chico. 19 years old, she was a bright, kind girl from Cleveland, Ohio, who had moved west in search of independence and a fresh start of her own. Chico was supposed to be a new beginning, a place where she and her fiancé could build a life together. But instead, it became the last place she was ever seen alive. On the morning of January 31st, Marliz and her fiancé visited a local flea market at the Eagles Hall in downtown Chico. Witnesses later recalled seeing the couple together, browsing stalls and talking quietly, before things took a turn. The two argued, and Marliz decided to walk home on her own. Along the way, she apparently stopped to speak to a couple in a car, and that moment would become the last time anyone would see her. When her fiancé returned home later that day, she wasn't there. At first, he thought she might have gone to cool off, but as the hours stretched on, it became clear something was wrong. Her clothes were still in the closet. Her toothbrush was still in the bathroom. Nothing was disturbed, and there was no sign of a struggle. 2 days later, he went to the police. Officers searched the area around Chico, canvassed nearby neighbours and spoke to everyone who might have seen her walking that day, but no one had. It was as if she had just stepped off the street and disappeared into thin air. For years, the case remained cold. Marliz's name appeared in missing persons reports, but without evidence or a body, there was little anyone could do. Her family was left to wonder what had happened, whether she had run away, been abducted, or fallen victim to something even darker. It wasn't until 1984, 8 years after she vanished, that her name surfaced again. That year, a woman named Janice Hooker came forward with a confession. She claimed that she and her husband, Cameron Hooker, had kidnapped a woman named Colleen Stan, and that her husband had been keeping her in their home for years with a locked box over her head. He kept her as his sex slave. He would assault her and torture her for years, until finally his wife went to her church and confessed what had been going on. But after some further probing, it appeared Colleen wasn't the first woman they had kidnapped. There had been another that had gone terribly wrong. Janice admitted that in January of 1976, they had met a woman she believed to be Mary Elizabeth Spanicky. Janice said Cameron had forced the woman into their car and taken her to their home in Red Bluff, about 40 miles north of Chico. There, according to Janice, Cameron had placed a foamed lined box over her head so that no one could hear her screaming. He didn't want to murder the woman. He wanted to keep her. Increasingly concerned about her making noise, Cameron decided to attempt to sever her vocal cords. The couple took her upstairs to the bathroom, and Cameron took a knife to her. But it went badly. Cameron rushed the now heavily bleeding Marliz back down to the basement. When Janice came back down a short while later, she found Marliz hanging from a noose attached to a hook in the basement ceiling. Cameron had killed her. Janice told investigators they had wrapped the body and buried it somewhere off a rural route near a local national park. Police searched the area she described but found nothing. No remains, no personal belongings, no trace of Marliz. Without a body and no physical evidence, the prosecutors went ahead with the case, based purely on the abduction of Colleen, who Janice and Cameron had kept in captivity for 7 years. The case got nationwide attention, and Cameron was sentenced to 104 years in prison, but he was not charged for the murder of Marliz. For nearly 3 decades, her name was only known to a few investigators, her family, and those who remembered the brief news story about the girl who vanished after an argument. But in the early 2000s, her story took a strange and unexpected turn. Jody, still being plagued by the dreams all these years later, finally decided to call the police again in 2008. The officer who took her message said he likely would have ignored it if it wasn't for the rather bizarre timing. Jody had called right at the point that the police were attempting to reopen the case. An officer met with Jody in a coffee shop. She laid out the whole story, the haunting, the dreams. She then said there was something specific she kept getting in her dreams. It seemed like it was just a series of letters and numbers, but she wanted to tell him in case it helped. She said she kept seeing 35.76 A17. The officer, who had been unable to tell Jody any of the details of the investigation, was stunned. Janice Hooker, who had been given immunity for coming forward about her husband's crimes, had taken the police out to the area where she thought the body of Marliz was buried a number of times, but they were never able to figure out the exact spot. But there was a road that ran through that area. The road was A17, and the police officer noted that 35.76 seemed to almost perfectly match up with the distance from the Hooker's home and where Janice had taken them to search for the body. It was enough of a coincidence to make the police return to this area. Jody believed that somehow Marliz was trying to send her messages to try and help the police find her body, to finally lay her to rest and give her family a definitive answer of what had happened to her. But despite numerous attempts, her body has still not been discovered, leaving the story of Marliz as not just a tragic unsolved mystery, but also one of the darkest paranormal cases of all time. Good evening. Tonight we're going to be doing something a little different here at the Tape Library. I have another deep dive into a terrifying haunting coming out for Halloween, but in the meantime I thought I'd invite some friends along to help me tell some true ghost stories. Some you will know, others you may not. These are some of the darkest paranormal cases I've ever heard, although there are a few slightly lighter ones thrown in as well. I like to think of this as a paranormal mixtape. If you all enjoy this, I might make this something we do once or twice a year. So if there are any creators you would like to see get involved in this series in the future, mention them in the comments below, and who knows, maybe they'll pop up in volume 2. But with that out of the way, get yourself a warm drink, dim the lights and get comfortable. Some of my friends have been sending me tapes, and I intend to share them with you tonight. These are just some of the darkest paranormal cases. Welcome to the Tape Library. Let's kick things off with our first tape, and a face I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. And oh boy, does he have a good story to share.
On a late afternoon in 2012, a man named Bill Vale was getting ready to head home from his job at a water purification company in Texas. Bill was currently an engineer, a former quality manager for a NASA subcontractor. After a rather tough divorce, he'd moved back to his hometown to work for his brother and get a fresh start. But just as he was about to leave for the day, a last-minute service call came in. The customer was a woman who needed someone to come out to her apartment in Arlington, Texas, and she had a very strange but rather specific request: that the technician had to arrive at exactly 5 p.m., not a minute before, not a minute after. And of course, Bill thought it was odd, but it was a job, so he took the call. And so at 5 p.m. on the dot, Bill pulled up to a nondescript apartment complex and he found the right unit. And as he walked up to the door, he noticed it was slightly open. And from inside, he could hear this kind of low rhythmic chanting. Figuring he should just announce himself, he pushed the door open a little more and peered inside. The room was pretty dark and he could tell that it was lit by flickering candles, and from the candlelight, the walls were marked with all of these bizarre symbols, and in the very center were several figures in dark cloaks gathered around someone lying on the floor. It appeared as if some kind of occult ritual was taking place. Before Bill could even think of what to do, the woman who seemed to be leading the ceremony looked up and locked eyes with him, and her face had so much intensity, and she raised a finger and pointed it directly at Bill and screamed a command that made no sense. She wasn't yelling at Bill, but it felt like she was yelling at something he couldn't see, and she screamed, "Get out of these people! Leave these people now!" Bill completely froze, the chanting in the room rose, and now smoke was kind of swirling everywhere, and he became overwhelmed with pure terror. He stumbled backwards, turned, and fled. He didn't stop running until he was back in his truck, and his hands were trembling on the steering wheel, and his heart was beating out of control. He didn't know what to do, so he immediately called his office, and he told them, "Look, I don't know who that person was, but whatever you do, don't ever send me back to that place." Well, later that evening, when Bill was back at home and, trying to put the whole bizarre incident out of his mind, he figured he just stumbled upon some strange religious ceremony, and that was that. He was watching TV, just trying to relax, when out of the corner of his eye, he saw something moving. It was this dark shadow, but very low to the ground, and kind of skittered across the living room floor and then disappeared under the couch. Bill jumped up again, completely freaked out, and so he grabbed a flashlight, and he was convinced that a rat or a squirrel had somehow gotten into the house. He looked under the couch, behind the furniture, he looked everywhere, but he didn't find anything. He did his best to convince himself it was just, the light, or maybe because his day was stressful that he was imagining things, and so he let it go. But later that night, as he was lying in bed, it happened again. This time though, the shape actually darted across the foot of his bed, and it was obviously too big to be a rat. So he shot up, flipped on the lights, and again, he couldn't find anything. The room was totally empty. Now, because Bill had previous work with NASA, he was a very hardened skeptic, right? He's trying to find a logical explanation for this because he doesn't believe in the paranormal. But regardless of any sort of logical explanation he could muster, he was really feeling full of fear and dread because something abnormal was clearly happening. And within even a few days of these strange occurrences happening, it began to transform into full-blown physical events. Just a few nights later, he was jolted awake by his bed, shaking violently as if there was an earthquake. He'd leap out of bed and the shaking would stop. Books would suddenly topple off his shelves for no reason. Faucets in the kitchen would turn on and off by themselves, blasting water into the sink. Light bulbs would explode, and probably the creepiest of all is that he would hear voices. He'd be walking down the hall at night and hear these strange disembodied voices, but they were speaking in this kind of guttural foreign language he couldn't understand. And it always sounded like it was coming from just around the corner or from inside a closet. But every time he would try to investigate, he'd be met with nothing. Now, this was really starting to wear Bill down after a while because this was a man who solved problems for a living. He was very logical, but he couldn't define the problem. He felt like he was just losing his mind, that he was going crazy. But just a few days later, Bill was on the phone with his ISP, trying to figure out why his connection had suddenly died. And as they were speaking on the phone, Bill could hear the line begin to crackle with static, and then through the noise, another very low guttural voice cut in, and it began growling or just speaking the same garbled foreign words that neither of them could understand. It really freaked Bill out, and he's just listening, and even the technician on the other end of the line blurted out, "Did you hear that? Oh my gosh, what is that?" Bill was completely petrified by this. He realized he wasn't crazy, that somebody else had heard it. This thing, whatever it was clearly real, but before either of them could say anything, the line went dead. The technician, who was clearly shaken, would later admit he never wanted to hear anything like it again. And in fact, one night, just after 3 a.m, Bill once again was jolted awake. The room, of course, was dark, and before he could process what had woken him, this icy grip locked around his ankle. And as this happened, he could feel distinct bony fingers gripping his bare skin. Immediately, he panicked and kicked wildly, trying to break free, and he tumbled out of bed, yanking his leg away from whoever this unseen attacker was, and he scrambled across the floor, fumbling for the light switch, and flipped it on. Of course, the room was empty. There was nobody there. But as he sat on the floor, trying to figure out what the heck happened, he could have sworn he could still feel the cold imprint of those fingers on his skin. At this point, he had to face the facts. He was under attack by something he couldn't see. Desperate for help, he started confiding in a few people he trusted. and one was a close friend, Michael, who was a professional audio engineer. And so during a late night call, Bill was frantically explaining the latest events when, right on cue, that same voice crackled over the line. And Michael heard it too. Acting on instinct, Michael, who was in his studio at the time, was recording it on his high-end equipment. And he watched in real time as this mysterious voice registered on these jagged waveforms on his screen. He now had visual proof. But when the voice stopped and Michael played back the recording, there was nothing. Well, the conversation of Michael and Bill were there, but the voice that they had both heard wasn't in the recording. Soon after this, Bill's brother, Bob, and his wife, Cindy, came over. And, they were, of course, very skeptical, but very worried about Bill, and they agreed to help him investigate. Almost immediately, the entity made its presence known. As Bob was standing inside a closet, this heavy thud came from inside, and Bob yelped as something unseen smacked him right in the face. He came out rubbing his cheek, trying to laugh it off, but you could tell he was very shaken by this. Later, the three of them were trying to watch TV in the living room when a dark shape skittered in the next room. Bill jumped up, and even Bob had to admit that he'd seen something. So Bob proposed an experiment. He and Cindy would sit in Bill's chair and watch the kitchen only in the peripheral vision, just like Bill had done when he'd seen the shadows. A few moments later, they all heard a clatter, and they whipped their heads around just in time to see a small, hunched silhouette leap onto the kitchen table, knock a glass fruit bowl to the floor where it shattered, and then dash away into the dark. Figuring this was their smoking gun to solving this mystery, they all got up and frantically searched the entire house. But folks, there were no animals, there were no signs of a break-in, there were no intruders. All of them were very perplexed, but they all three described the creature the same way. Maybe 8 inches tall, scuttling around on 2 legs, kind of looking like a malformed child, but clearly not human. It would turn out that the ritual Bill had stumbled upon was not what it seemed. He had assumed he was walking in on some kind of dark occult summoning, but the truth was far more terrifying and more personal. Bill now believes that what he witnessed was not a summoning, but an exorcism. The cloaked figures weren't trying to call a demon into the world, they were trying to cast one out of the people who were already possessed, and that strange, specific appointment, Bill suspects, was no coincidence. The point of him arriving at 5 p.m. was to serve as a new vessel for this demonic host. What she screamed wasn't for him to leave, it was an order directed at the demon to now enter the new host, Bill. And even now, to this day, he continues to live in that house and continues to experience the paranormal phenomenon. The activity does ebb and flow, but it has never fully gone away.
Next up, we have a returning friend of the channel who I know many of you are a huge fan of. And he has something a little different that he wants to talk about. He's had an experience of his own. One that he can't explain.
On my channel, Into the Fog, I share true stories of the paranormal, many of which come from viewer experiences, and they are chilling. But personally speaking, though, I haven't had many of my own encounters. But 2 things have happened in my life that I find particularly inexplicable, events that still leave me cold when I think about them. The first was a terrifying series of events from when I was a teenager. That's a little too involved to share here, but tonight I want to tell you about my most recent experience. It really frightened me. As well as having a YouTube channel, I'm an author and speaker. And during the Halloween season of 2024, I was invited to speak at a series of events in Massachusetts, New England. I planned to travel around the state, visiting places like Salem and Providence, Rhode Island. I stayed in hotels and Airbnbs. But while I was speaking in Easton, Massachusetts, my home for 3 nights was rather more grand. I was to share a talk for Ames Free Library, and they offered to put me up in a sumptuous New England mansion that sits in the beautiful landscaped library grounds. They call it Queset House. Now, I'm not a ghost hunter or a paranormal investigator. I'm just like a journalist who tells the cases to other people, so I don't have a lot of experiences in staying overnight in haunted locations. but I was told that the mansion had a ghost or two. Well, before heading out, I looked at some pictures of the place, and I felt actually quite nervous about going there, particularly because I'd be staying there alone. I ended up staying for 3 nights there. And the library has a special place in the house for authors in residence, and I was given pretty much the entire 3rd floor to live on. I was sitting in the writing room one night when I had my first inkling of something strange in the house. I couldn't get the TV to work, so I was watching Instagram videos at my writing desk when I felt a sudden wave of coldness hit me. Now, I've shared enough paranormal accounts to know that a sudden cold sensation is almost cliche. My goodness, does it feel strange when you actually experience it. It was an almost instant, skin-tingling drop. Later that night, I went to bed. I slept well until 3 a.m. when something woke me. I didn't get woken by a sound, you understand, because I wear these cocoon sleep headphones that play ambient sounds as I sleep. They tend to block out other noises. So I didn't hear anything unusual. It was what I felt that woke me. The feeling of 2 hands curling around my shins. Not only that, this was a shocking feeling. It felt like the hands were starting to push me up and down on the bed, like boom, 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 bounce, bounce, bounce. This crazy sensation woke me up instantly, and I'll admit it. I was so scared in that moment that I dared not to open my eyes. I kept them tightly shut. My legs were bouncing up and down. But then I knew I had to open them, and so maybe a few seconds later I slowly fluttered my eyes open, and there was nobody there. At the end of the bed, just my legs, settling. Oh, and by the way, because I was so creeped out at this house, I'd left all of the lights on in the room. But again, I saw nothing. Now, was this some kind of sleep paralysis? Maybe, but all I can say is I've never had sleep paralysis before in my life or since. Well, I was really creeped out by this, of course, but I was in a different country with nowhere else to go, so I stayed in bed. And after a while, I managed to fall back to sleep. The next morning, I rushed over to the library as soon as it opened, and I just had to tell somebody about what had happened in the night. I probably looked like a crazy person hurrying up to the desk, but I did, and they saw me and said, you must be the author. Maybe I look like one, I don't know. I said, hi, I'm Peter Lawson. We chatted, but then I told them about what had happened. That something had grabbed my ankles at around 3 a.m. That's why I said that. That the woman behind the counter looked at me funny. She said, interesting. The previous author had stayed in that room, and she had had an encounter with something at that time as well. It sent a shiver through me. I know the 3 a.m. thing is a bit cliche as well, but when you're actually experiencing it, it's not so cliche. It's scary. Now, I kind of had avoided learning about the ghost stories of the place before I traveled to America for that trip. I didn't want to freak myself out while I was staying there, but now I was there, I thought, look, I'm going to make a video about this place. And I was told that previous people had seen ghostly presences in that house. Some had been frightening, but others were more playful, this woman told me. When I heard the word playful, I felt goosebumps. I'd assumed that someone grabbing my legs and banging me up and down was an aggressive gesture, but I suddenly, in that word, thought about my own children and how they, when they were younger, might have done that to me in bed for a laugh. I just thought, what if it wasn't aggression? What happens if a kid was playing, bouncing me up and down? Well, as I was making a video about the ghost stories of the mansion, the town historian turned up in his car. He was running a movie club in the downstairs room. Well, I chatted to him, and he confirmed that the place that was haunted most was the 3rd floor, the one I was on. But he also confirmed that a young child had died in a pond at the house. Now, this confused me because, frankly, I hadn't seen a pond. That's when he told me that it had been bricked over after the tragedy of this death. It turned out that the bricked over pond was directly under my bedroom window where I had felt the hands grab me. Well, something else happened in the bed that was crazy. I was lying asleep when another movement happened. It was right at the side of the mattress to my right. It was starting to press down, like someone was climbing onto it. And then I felt the pressure coming onto the right side of my body. I vividly remember that the mattress went down first, then me. It felt like someone was literally kind of rolling or climbing on top of me, and I was trembling with the feeling of it. But again, there was nothing there, and the sensation just disappeared. Now, did I have an actual paranormal experience in the house? Well, some of you will say it was all in my mind. Maybe it was. All I can say is that I've never experienced anything like that before or since. And that moment, those moments, prompted me to make my video on the mansion, which included speaking to other witnesses who had also had frightening encounters in Quezet House. For someone who hasn't had many experiences of the paranormal, I left the New England mansion with the distinct impression that I had actually encountered something beyond explanation. And I felt a weird sense of thrill at that, but also fear. The thought that if that is true, what else might be out there? Well, I'm Peter Laws, and if you feel like hearing the whole story, which I filmed on location in the house, you could check out my channel Into the Fog with Peter Laws.
I promised you dark, and this one is going to be dark. Coming from Carol Ann from the supremely underrated channel The In-Between, this is the story of the hangman.
There's a moment every child dreads. That instant when the closet door creaks open in the dead of night and something that shouldn't exist steps out. But what happens when that nightmare doesn't disappear with the morning light? What happens when it follows you across borders, through death, and into the next generation? I'm Carol Ann. Welcome to The In-Between. Oscar Mendoza was born a very special child. He just didn't know it right away. He's blessed with what some would call the sight. When he's around 9 years old, Oscar and his family live in a rough neighborhood of Dallas, Texas. One day he's wandering these streets in an area that no kid should be hanging out in, wanders down an alley and stumbles upon the hideous form of a man wearing a bloody butcher's apron, an even bloodier smile, and a noose hanging from his neck. The man looks at Oscar and grins. Just then, Oscar's mother grabs his hand and says, "We gotta get out of here." Once they're away, she asks him, "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be at home." Oscar's response is, "Did you see that man?" "What man?" She didn't see anything. That night, Oscar's settling into bed when he hears the familiar creak of his closet door opening. Oscar gets up from bed and goes to close the door. When he turns back around, the same man he saw in the alley that afternoon is now sitting in his room with that huge bloody smile. The man that Oscar comes to think of as the hangman comes to visit Oscar in his room every night after that. He can feel that whatever this thing is, it is evil. Night after night, the hangman visits and Oscar can't sleep. He even tries to tell his older brother Juan about it, but Juan doesn't believe him, and Oscar starts to think he's cursed. Later that summer, Oscar's family goes to Mexico on vacation. Every year, they stay with his grandparents at their 3-story villa in San Felipe, Guanajuato. After so many countless nights of no sleep, he's anxious to get away from the hell that is his daily life and just hopes that the hangman doesn't follow. One of the highlights of these trips is playing with their grandfather's sweet, shaggy old black dog that is the best friend that any little kid can have. It would tag along with the boys all over town whenever they ventured out to explore. They always visit at the same time of the year so that they can celebrate the festival of San Felipe. Huge celebrations with a circus and a parade. Oscar, Juan, and their cousin Armando all climb on top of their grandfather's roof to watch the passing parade. And as a full car of clowns is passing their house, it crashes, ejecting all of the clowns onto the street. Now, Juan's thinking this is part of the show, and he starts laughing and clapping and pointing at the absolute spectacle of clowns laying everywhere. As kids usually do, The others join in, but soon they realize it's not a joke. Juan, who's 10, still thinks it's funny, and he points at the clowns on the ground and starts laughing. One clown on the ground, bloody and not moving, suddenly looks at Oscar, winks, and smiles at him with the hangman's huge bloody smile. Right then, Oscar knew the hangman had followed him after all. But this time, Oscar's not the only one to see it. Both his brother and his cousin see the evil grin from the bloody clown as well. And sad as it sounds, there's a little part of Oscar that's actually kind of excited because at least he now knows that he's not going crazy. Their parents come home a little later and tell them that the car had lost control, killing the entire clown troupe. Juan says, "Well, that can't be right. One of them turned their head and winked at me." Unfortunately for Juan, he's known as a bit of a prankster, so his parents don't believe him. When it's time for bed, the grandkids all stay in a room together in a huge king-size bed on the first floor right next to their grandparents. All of the rooms have metal doors that can lock from the inside, and their room also has another wooden door that connects with the kitchen that has a baseball-sized hole in it. The night after the accident, all of the cousins, including the oldest cousin, Naomi, who's 15, are all sleeping in the bed. Naomi usually doesn't sleep with them, but Juan asks her to stay because he's still pretty spooked about the whole dead clown thing. Around 3 a.m., Juan wakes up in a cold sweat, so he gives Naomi a push. "What? Come with me to get some water." After more pushing from Juan, she finally gives in. Okay. As the two climb out of bed, the movement wakes up Oscar, who watches them head to the big wooden door and open it up to the kitchen. As the door swings open, all three of them see a man wearing a clown suit, complete with big shoes and white hands covered in blood, sitting in a chair, staring at the wall. He looks dirty and wet, but Oscar recognizes it as the same clown that Juan had mocked as he lay in the street. Naomi screams and slams the door, and she and Juan lean against it to try to keep whatever is out there out there. Suddenly, there's a push at the door that is so hard that it cracks the door. Oscar jumps up and takes a spot at the door, trying to help them keep whatever it is from getting inside. Through the hole in the door, this bloody gloved hand comes through, trying to grab anything within reach. When it comes up empty, it disappears, and instead they see the thing bend down to look through the opening with one bloody gray eye. He tells the children in Spanish,
"Let me in, children. I just want to play. Don't laugh at me."
After what feels like forever, Grandpa comes out of his room with his shotgun and releases his big black dog. They feel the pushing at the door stop as the thing turns to deal with the attacking dog. They hear whimpering and everything goes quiet. Grandpa walks over and opens the wooden door, and the children look out into the kitchen to see the body of their faithful furry friend lying on the kitchen floor with its neck snapped. A loud crash in the courtyard outside grabs their attention. It sounds like somebody had leapt from an upper story window, but the commotion is enough to wake up the entire neighborhood, and one of the neighbors calls the police. The police come, but they don't find anything. Nothing outside, no broken windows, no signs of forced entry. The kitchen has this horrible, lingering stench of death, and the chair is covered in a black, oozing film. Oscar overhears his grandfather tell the policeman that he thought he saw a man wearing a bloody clown costume. But he knows that's impossible because all of the clowns died in the accident. The next day, Grandpa gets a priest to come over and bless the house. Even he, the family rock, is shaken by the experience. Fast forward a few days, vacation is over, and Oscar and his family return to Dallas. And the hangman resumes his nightly visits to Oscar. Until one night, shortly after the family had moved to a new house down the street, Oscar's moving his things into his new room when he realizes there's a door in his room. So he tries the door, but it's locked. All right, whatever. And Oscar goes back to settling into his new room. He turns around again to see the door is now open. As he takes a few steps closer, Oscar can smell death on the stale air that comes rolling out of that space. He grabs a flashlight and looks into the space to discover a pretty large room. He walks in a few steps and the door slams shut behind him. He spins around and is stopped in his tracks by the hangman, who pushes him to the ground. Oscar's shocked. This is the first time the hangman has actually touched him. And things just get worse after that. The hangman appears every night when Oscar falls asleep and starts hitting and scratching him, leaving bruises all over his face and his arms. Until one night, it's different. It doesn't come to Oscar. It comes to his brother. Oscar sees him standing over his little brother's bed, and the hangman tells Oscar, "I'll take him instead." Oscar can't see any way out of this hell. He can't let the hangman take his little brother, but the only solution his little kid head can see is suicide. So he goes to his room, chugs an entire bottle of cough syrup, and lays down on his bed. As he slips out of consciousness and into the darkness, he finds himself in a strange room that looks like a cross between an operating room and a slaughterhouse. He can hear people screaming around him, and he realizes he's in hell. In walks the hangman, swinging a cleaver, shouting,
You know who I am.
The hangman pulls the cleaver back and starts to swing, and as Oscar braces for the impact of a cleaver to the neck, he feels his mother shaking him awake. His little brother had found him in bed, and the two had been praying over him and shaking him, trying to get him to wake up. After that night, everything changes. The hangman never returns. Oscar is suddenly free to have the life he's been robbed of for so many years. He finishes school, he gets a job, he gets married, he has kids. The curse is gone and life is good. Until one day, one of his children comes to him and says, "Daddy, I see strange things." Holy crap! I read Stephen King's It when I was in high school, so clowns have been ruined for me for a while, but at least I had the comfort of knowing that it was fiction. Now we have to deal with real ones too? Be careful out there, and I will see you again on The In-Between.
I want to jump back in and share a story with you all quickly before we continue on. I did actually feature this in a very early episode of my second show, Night Drive Paranormal, but most of you won't have heard that, and this is a story that I genuinely love, so I wanted to tell it again to a wider audience. This is a story I remember first hearing as a child, and one that has stuck with me to this day. Every time we're out on a night drive, it plays in the back of my head. Have you ever heard the strange story of the hairy hands? This is a story that has been passed around a stretch of road in Dartmoor. A story I remember hearing when I was just a little kid. Many have claimed to experience this strange piece of paranormal phenomena. In June of 1921, a man who was working at nearby Dartmoor prison was driving along a narrow lane that ran parallel to the moors. His children were sat in the sidecar of the motorcycle, when all of a sudden, the man lost control. He crashed the bike. The kids luckily were able to throw themselves from the sidecar, just in time, but the man was tragically killed in front of his children. A terrible accident, right? However, shortly after this, a similar incident occurred. Just 2 months later, in fact, a young British Army officer was thrown from his bike onto a grassy verge on the same stretch of road. When questioned, he went on to say this: "It was not my fault. Believe it or not, something drove me off the road. A pair of hairy hands closed over mine. I felt them as plainly as ever I felt anything in my whole life. Large, muscular, hairy hands. I fought them for all I was worth, but they were too strong for me. They forced the machine into the turf at the edge of the road. and I knew no more till I came to myself, lying a few feet away on my face on the turf. On another occasion, a motorcycle was riding down the lane, this time with 2 adults on it, one driving and one on the back. They too lost control of the bike and were forced off the road, luckily in this case surviving. Much like the army captain, they said they saw, as the driver lost control, a pair of hands, hairy hands, that materialised out of nowhere, grabbed the handlebars and took control of the bike for just a few moments. A few years later, in 1924, a couple were staying in a caravan right by the same stretch of road. The wife was sleeping facing one of the windows when she heard something. Carefully she shuffled over, trying not to wake her husband. She wiped the condensation off of the window to look out into the night and see if she could see anything. There, pressed up and moving along the window, was a pair of hands. Hands she claimed were covered in hair, before they slowly faded away in front of her eyes. But this was just the start, with countless people right up to modern days claiming they too have experienced the hairy hands, grabbing the steering wheels of their cars, pulling hair to try and distract drivers, running motorcyclists off the road. A simple urban legend that people are using to blame their reckless driving on a particularly challenging bit of road? Or is there something more to it? Whatever the answer is, maybe you should take extra special care. You never know what could be out there. Our next storyteller comes from outside of the realm of YouTube. This is a personal account that he was sent in by a listener of his show, and I got chills when I first heard it. But I'll let him introduce himself.
I'm Rob Kirkup, the host of the How Haunted podcast. Every other Friday, I go deep into the horrible history and terrifying ghost stories of one of the scariest places on the planet. Every now and then, listeners accompany me on paranormal investigations, where they'll hear the audio from that night, so they can become part of the team and hear what happened exactly as it happened. And every December, in the big Nightmare Before Christmas special, I read real-life ghost stories sent in by listeners. And I'm going to read a story for you now that'll feature much later this year. This story was sent in by Neil. This happened in 2004 and keeps me awake to this day. I was a student at university and shared a flat with a guy who I shall call Paul. Paul and I got along okay. We were never great friends, but we'd both shared with somebody else in our first year who was friends to the pair of us. He dropped out after the first year, but Paul and I continued to keep the rental on in our second year of university. It didn't really matter that we weren't really close. I did my thing, he did his, and it worked just fine. At the beginning of December that year, 2004, a couple of weeks before we'd head off home for Christmas, he knocked on my door one morning before we set off for university and asked if I had a moment for a chat. I told him that I had an early lecture and I was running late, but asked if it would be okay if we caught up after university that evening. I went to university. I remember the weather was awful that day, as I was soaked to my skin when I got back to our flat. I was sitting watching TV. I'd not seen Paul yet, but before long I heard footsteps, and he walked past the doorway to the living room where I was sitting alone. I shouted "Hey" over to him. He stopped, looked at me, smiled, and then walked past the room towards his bedroom. An hour or so passed, and I went and knocked on his door to see if he wanted to come and watch a movie, and we could chat about whatever it was he'd wanted to speak about that morning. He didn't answer, so I knocked again. No answer. I opened the door and popped my head in. He was lying in his bed. I said his name. He didn't respond, so I put the light on, and straight away my heart started pounding in my chest. He was white. He wasn't breathing. I checked his pulse, and there wasn't one. I rang 999. I was a complete mess. The paramedics came. He was pronounced dead, and his body was taken away. I'm crying typing this, as he died of an intentional overdose. He'd asked to talk to me, but I was too busy for him. If I just spent 5 minutes talking to him, maybe he'd have been okay. We never found out what it was that drove him to do what he did. But what I do know is that the autopsy revealed that he'd been dead since some point between 10 AM and 11 AM that morning. 7 or 8 hours before I'd seen him smile back at me when I'd seen him walking through our flat.
Next, we've got a real hidden gem of a storyteller from YouTube. This is Mr. E-Files, and he's got a great little poltergeist case to share with you all.
Okay, so most of you know the 1982 movie called Poltergeist. A family that is terrorized by supernatural forces, objects flying around, the classic "they're here" line. You know, pure Hollywood horror. But what if I told you there's a poltergeist case that's been officially documented by government scientists, witnessed by hundreds of people, and has never been debunked despite decades of investigation? Oh, and it didn't happen in some remote haunted house, but in a respectable law firm in broad daylight, with electrical engineers and physicists recording every impossible event. If you think that sounds interesting, you have no idea what's coming for you by the end. I am Mr. E-Files, and I just want to say thank you to the Tape Library for this collaboration. It truly means a lot. But let's get into the story. The time was November in 1967. Rosenheim, Bavaria, a quiet, German town where nothing unusual ever happened. Sigmund Adam ran his law practice without incident for years. Respectable clients, routine paperwork, predictable days. His office staff, though, included a 19-year-old secretary named Anne-Marie Scherbel. And she was quiet, professional, and kind of unremarkable. That is, until the phone started ringing. Okay, so at first it just seemed like a technical issue. The office phone would ring constantly. But when answered, there was only this automatic speaking clock, a service that tells you the current time when you dial a specific number. But the thing is, nobody was dialing that number. The phone company even investigated. No mechanical faults, no cross wires, no explanation for why the phones were automatically calling the speaking clock dozens of times a day. Then the bills arrived, and that's when everyone realized that this wasn't technical. The November phone bill showed over 600 calls to the speaking clock in a single month, during business hours when everyone could see that nobody else was using the phones. So the electrical company stumped at this point. They send in their technicians. They installed monitoring equipment. They checked every wire. They replaced the entire phone system. But the calls continued. But don't worry about that, because the phones were just the beginning. Because that's when the lights started going insane. Fluorescent tubes would explode without warning, showering the office with glass. New bulbs would unscrew themselves from fixtures while people were watching. Light switches just flipped on and off by themselves. So the electrical company at this point, they decided to bring in specialists. And they measured the power fluctuations. They checked for electromagnetic interference. They tested every single circuit. Everything was normal, except nothing was normal. Then something happened that made everybody realize that they weren't dealing with electricity. Because for one, the paintings started moving. These heavy framed pictures would rotate 360 degrees on walls while clients sat in the waiting room. Filing cabinets slid across the floors. Desk drawers open and slam shut by themselves. And remember, this was all during business hours with witnesses everywhere. But nobody was prepared for what would happen next. Now the copy machines began malfunctioning in ways that defied logic. They would jam constantly, but only when certain people were nearby. Specifically when Anne-Marie was in the room. And right there, that's when somebody noticed the pattern that changed everything. Every phenomenon, right? The phone calls, the exploding lights, the moving objects, they intensified when the 19-year-old secretary was present. So, of course, word spread pretty quick, and local newspapers picked up the story. And that's when the scientists arrived. And what they discovered would terrify them. Dr. Friedbart Karjar, a respected physicist, led a team of investigators with electromagnetic monitoring devices, cameras, and recording equipment. And they weren't believers in the paranormal, no. They were your hardcore skeptics with scientific instruments, determined to debunk what they assumed was fraud or mass hysteria. But you see, the thing is, they couldn't. Their instruments detected massive electromagnetic fluctuations with no identifiable sources. The disturbances were the strongest within 6 feet of Anne-Marie. But she wasn't carrying devices. She wasn't touching anything. She wasn't doing anything that could explain these readings. And that's when they witnessed something that left them speechless. During this one session, a heavy wooden cabinet slid 4 feet across the room while Dr. Karjar measured electromagnetic activity. The readings spiked off the charts at that exact moment that the cabinet moved. And Anne-Marie, she was standing just 8 feet away. Her hands were visible. She wasn't touching anything. And multiple cameras captured it. Electromagnetic sensors recorded the anomalies. A dozen witnesses saw it happen. And when asked if she was scared, Anne-Marie stared at the floor and whispered,
"I think it's following me."
And that's when they realized that this was unlike anything that they had ever encountered. And by December of 1967, the phenomena had escalated until the law firm could basically not even function. I mean, the phones, they rang nonstop. The lights exploded daily. Office equipment malfunctioned constantly. So the German government got involved. Official investigators, documented hundreds of incidents. Engineers from Siemens installed monitoring equipment that recorded electromagnetic disturbance that they could not explain. Journalists arrived from all over Europe. Skeptics came to debunk the case. Scientists brought increasingly sophisticated equipment in. But yet, nobody could explain what was happening. But everybody could see that it was real. Then, in January 1968, something happened that revealed the terrifying truth about the Rosenheim poltergeist. January 19th, 1968, Anne-Marie Schaberl left her job at that law firm. And the moment that she walked out the door, every single phenomena stopped. And I'm not talking gradually or over a few days. Instantly, like the flick of a switch. The phone stopped calling the speaker clock. The lights stopped exploding. The objects stopped moving. The electromagnetic readings returned to normal. After 2 months of chaos that baffled scientists, engineers, and government investigators, the Rosenheim poltergeist simply just ended. 57 years of investigation has produced zero explanation for what happened in that German law office. But here is what's even more disturbing. From the moment that Anne-Marie left the law firm, she vanished from public record. Despite being one of the most documented people in paranormal history, with hundreds of witness testimonies, scientific recordings, and the government files all centered around her, somehow she disappeared. Yeah, let me know in the comments if you truly believe that. But there were no interviews, no follow-ups, no trace. The woman at the center of Germany's most famous paranormal case just was simply gone. But here is actually the part that should keep you awake tonight. In 1994, 26 years after Rosenheim, there was another poltergeist case in Munich. Different city, different people, same impossible phenomenon. But at the center of it, a quiet office worker in her 40s. Now, the investigators never released her name, but the age matches Anne-Marie perfectly. Do you still think this is fake? Well, find Anne-Marie Schaberl. She's out there somewhere, probably in her 70s right now. Find her, and I'll pay whatever she wants for an exclusive interview. Because if anybody can finally explain what happened in that German law office, it's the woman who was at the center of it all. The woman who might just be the most dangerous person that you've never heard of. That's the Rosenheim poltergeist. And Anne-Marie is the only one that knows all the details. And she's out there.
I think it's time to visit a slightly more well-known haunted location. And who better to talk about it than the excellent Don't Scare Claire.
Everyone thinks they know the Stanley Hotel because of its connections to Stephen King, but the real horror has nothing to do with creepy twins or hacking down doors with an axe. It's in rooms like 401, which have a reputation for genuine terror, but almost nobody talks about it, so I'm going to. One sunny spring day in 2003, a mother and her 2 daughters were wandering the halls after lunch, just exploring. When they reached the 4th floor, they decided, let's just call it a day and head for the lift down. They've seen everything that there was to see, that was that. But that's when they heard it. A faint squeak. They all looked to the source of the noise and they could clearly see that it was a door handle to one of the guest rooms, slowly turning all the way until the handle clicked and the door creaked open all on its own. The door was to room 401. It didn't swing wide open as it would have if you were a guest in the room leaving to go down to the restaurant for a meal or anything like that. It just crept open slowly, revealing what looked like an empty guest room. No one lurking inside, nothing but that weird, heavy silence, almost as if the room itself was inviting, daring them to come closer. One of the daughters, she was 18 years old, and she started to move towards room 401, saying, oh, I'm just gonna take a little look inside, I want to see what the rooms are like. Just a peek, you never know when you're gonna get the chance again, so what's the harm in it? Although, if a door to an empty bedroom did creak open really slowly, that's just taken straight out of the horror movie playbook, so maybe it's not a good idea to go towards it? I don't know, that just seems like Final Girl 101. But curiosity getting the better of her, the daughter started just tentatively walking into room 401. As soon as she crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her, trapping the girl inside. In that instant, she screamed. Her mother sprinted over, frantically turning the handle, trying to open the door. But it was one of those hotel doors. You needed a room key to unlock it. The young girl on the other side was panicking, her voice was cracking, begging her mom to try and get her out, but the door wouldn't budge. All at once, another scream tore from that room, followed by a heavy thud. Okay, now this was getting serious. Had her daughter just fallen and hurt herself somehow? But as soon as the room fell silent, the door to room 401 clicked and unlocked itself just as easily as that. The mother rushed into the room to find her daughter cowering against the far wall, huddled up, nowhere near the door, and just shaking like a leaf. Just absolutely terrified, the poor thing. Through her sobs, the girl told her mom she'd been trying to open the door when the closet door had flung open. Something cold had come up right close, so close that she could feel the breath on her skin, and it whispered right in her ear. She couldn't even make out the words, but whatever it was, it didn't sound friendly. But then, just as quick, the cold breath was gone and the closet door slammed shut again. Both mother and daughter bolted out of the room in that moment, not daring to look behind them. And once they were back out in the relative safety of the hallway, their hearts pounding in their chests, they heard the door to 401 slam one last time behind them. Just unimaginable terror. I think if that had happened to me, I'd be exactly the same as the girl who raced out of the hotel and waited by the car for her mom and her sister to catch up with her. Terrifying. But that was just one story from a visitor during the day at the Stanley Hotel. Imagine what gets reported from people who unexpectedly check out in the early hours of the morning. So if you want to know who or what may have been behind that whisper in room 401, I've got an hour-long deep dive into the Stanley's history and hauntings over on my channel, Don't Scare Claire. It'd be great to see you over there. Because if the rumors are true, the ghost in room 401 is not someone you want to stumble across, especially if you're a woman. But for now, a huge thank you to the Tape Library for having me, and if you're ready for more haunted history, you know where to find me. So until next time, sleep safe.
We're running out of time on our evening of ghost stories, but I'm so pleased to bring you someone that long-time fans of the show may be familiar with, and he has a story we might give the full tape library treatment in the future, because it is a good one. Coming over the airwaves from the Middle East, this is Taroxa.
There's a saying that the dead can't speak, but in one forgotten corner of West Virginia, they did, and their voice led to a conviction. This is the story of Zona Heister Shue, a young woman who died under strange circumstances in 1897. Her death would be ruled natural by a lazy doctor, covered up by a charming new husband, and almost completely forgotten until she returned, not in the way you'd expect. No flickering lights, no levitating furniture, no screaming poltergeist. No, she came back in a dream, and what she did shattered a town's silence. Zona was only 23 when she married Erasmus Shue, a blacksmith new to the town of Greenbrier. He was quiet, kept to himself, but the locals thought he was off. Not evil, just strange. One cold January day, Erasmus sent a young boy to his home on an errand. What he found was chilling. Zona's body was lying at the bottom of the stairs, face frozen in horror, hands clenched, eyes wide open. The boy ran for help, but when the doctor arrived, something was already wrong. Erasmus was there, cradling her body, sobbing uncontrollably, and refusing to let the doctor properly examine her. Every time the doctor tried to check her neck, Erasmus would scream, rock her body, and claim she'd simply passed out from illness. Eventually the doctor gave up, and wrote it off as everlasting faint, whatever that meant. And just like that, Zona was buried. No autopsy, no questions. At least not until her mother started having dreams. Mary Jane Heister, Zona's mother, never liked Erasmus. Something about him unsettled her from the very beginning. But after the funeral, she started having visions. Not just dreams, but the kind of vivid encounters that felt more real than waking life. She claimed Zona appeared to her, night after night, and told her the truth. Erasmus was abusive, controlling, violent, and one night he had lost his temper over dinner. He snapped her neck. Zona even described exactly how it happened, the force, the angle, and how he crushed her windpipe with his bare hands. Now, most people would brush this off. Grief hallucinations. But Mary Jane, she wasn't like most people. She went straight to the prosecutor and demanded they reopen the case, because according to her, her daughter told her to. It sounds insane, but here's where things get unsettling. The prosecutor decided to dig into Erasmus's past and uncovered a pattern. This wasn't his first wife, it was his third. The first had died under mysterious circumstances. The second divorced him after he beat her relentlessly. The whispers started. The town that once ignored Zona's death suddenly had questions. So they examined her body, and when the autopsy was finally performed, it confirmed exactly what Mary Jane said. Zona's neck was broken, her windpipe crushed. The doctor even said it was like someone had twisted it completely around, just like in the dreams. Erasmus was arrested. During the trial, Mary Jane took the stand and told the jury everything, even the parts that sounded ridiculous. She said, "My daughter came back and told me what he did. 4 nights in a row, she was standing right at the foot of my bed." Now, you'd think that the jury would laugh her out of the courtroom, but strangely enough, they didn't. In fact, her testimony became a turning point. Erasmus Shue was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He died 3 years later, behind bars. To this day, the Greenbrier ghost remains the only documented case in US history where a ghost's testimony helped convict a killer. There's even a historical marker on the side of the road in Virginia that tells the story. No skepticism, no disclaimers, just one line that hits different. The only known case in which testimony from a ghost helped convict a murderer. Chilling, right? Whether you believe it was a supernatural justice or a grieving mother's intuition, one thing is certain. Zona didn't stay silent, and her voice, beyond the grave, made sure the truth was heard.
I thought I'd return for one more case to round out our stories tonight. This one got to me a little, as it really brings home that there is a world of darkness just beyond the realm of our day-to-day lives, taking places in houses with locked doors and with curtains drawn. But if this story shows an insight into a battle with the other world, or simply the actions of misguided human beings, well, I'll let you decide. In the summer of 2016, in a quiet house in Enfield, North London, a young man named Kennedy Ife began to lose touch with the world around him. He was 26, strong, intelligent, and deeply religious. But something inside him had started to change. It began with throat pain, then sleeplessness, and sudden bursts of agitation. He told his family he felt a presence, that something evil had taken hold of him. He spoke of a snake inside his body. He shouted and grew violent. He would not eat or rest. His family, frightened and faithful, believed he was possessed. They prayed for him. They read from the Bible and spoke the words of deliverance, calling on God to drive out the spirit they believed had taken root. The Ifes were members of a local Christian community. Their faith taught them that evil could inhabit a person's body. Kennedy's condition worsened. His father Kenneth and his brothers Roy, Harry, Colin, Samuel and Daniel gathered around him in the family home. They were afraid of what he might do to himself, or to them. When his behaviour turned erratic, they restrained him. Over the next 3 days, Kennedy struggled against the restraints, cable ties, rope and handcuffs. His family took turns watching him. They said they were protecting him, that they wanted to keep him safe. Sometimes they held him down when he thrashed. Sometimes they prayed beside him while he screamed. In their eyes, they were fighting a demon. They never called a doctor. By August 22nd, Kennedy's strength was fading. He was dehydrated and exhausted. His breathing grew shallow. His family said he complained of a sore throat and called for water. When they finally rang for paramedics, it was too late. Kennedy went into cardiac arrest. He was pronounced dead at the scene. When the police arrived, they found a grim sight. Kennedy's body was marked with more than 60 injuries, bruises, cuts, and even what appeared to be a bite. His family also bore signs of a struggle. The house was quiet now, heavy with the aftermath of something that could not be undone. To quote the BBC article on the case, jurors heard the family held deep religious beliefs and were connected with the Jesus Sanctuary Ministries in southeast London. On 19th of August, Kennedy became aggressive, bit his father and threatened to cut off his own penis. So his mother sought advice from a minister rather than seeking medical help. The family then set about attempting to cure Kennedy through restraint and prayer over the next 3 days, the court was told. Roy Ife said his brother's actions were shocking to hear, but he did not consider calling professional help because it was a domestic issue. Kenneth Ife told jurors he ordered his sons to take shifts and use overwhelming force, but denied that an association with cults, occults, and secret societies played any part in the death. The 26-year-old was pronounced dead after Harry Ife called emergency services, saying his brother had been complaining of dehydration. In the months that followed, the Ife family was charged with manslaughter, false imprisonment, and causing or allowing the death of a vulnerable adult. Prosecutors said they had mistaken illness for possession, that instead of seeking help they turned inward to faith and fear. In court, the family insisted they had acted out of love. They said they had never meant to harm him. They were praying for deliverance. The trial lasted for weeks. Witnesses spoke of Kennedy's final days, the prayers, the restraints, the confusion. There were no easy answers. In March 2019, the jury returned its verdict. The family was acquitted on all counts. The court accepted that they had believed they were saving him. This is just one of countless such stories, but I thought it was interesting just because it shows that this is a practice that still is very much a part of the lives of many. A tragedy of faith and fear, of a family who believed they were saving a soul while losing a son. An example of how the darkest paranormal cases often involve very real-world tragedy. That's all for this entry into the tape library. Thank you so much to everyone who got involved in this collaboration. I was blown away by how many people were up for it, and I think it meant we ended up with a really nice mix of different sized creators, as well as very different styles of telling a ghost story. If there is someone you particularly enjoyed here, be sure to give them a shout out in the comments, and of course links to all of their channels are in the description, so please go show these awesome people some love. Next episode will be our Halloween special. Last year we did the Gary Subrink calls, but for this one I wanted to do a traditional tape library haunted house deep dive. I know those are a favourite of a lot of you, and this is a case that I've been asked to cover so many times, so I can't wait to delve into this one. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe. Click like and hype on YouTube, or if you'd be so kind, leave me a 5-star rating on your podcast platform of choice. You can also support the show through YouTube memberships and Patreon. So let's give a big shout out to all those people who keep the reels spinning. Our tape library archivists, Yoinks on Away, Umiko Grimm, West Virginia Vegetable Man, Tina S, Thomas Boatwright, the God Emperor of Mankind, the Crimson DM, the Detective, the Bisexual Moon Cult, Stephen Lutman, Sean Miller, Sandy Lusk, Sarah Boyd, Rosary Subrabin, Plum Blossom, Pixelina, Monty Montes, Mirashard, Midia Sabine, Lisa Marie Sheridan, Lady Bette Noir, Juno, Judith Hacker, Joseph Condola, Jolly Jedi, Joe, Jamie Long, G-Raw, Gabrielle, Gina Britton, Emily Carlin, Eric Salas, Dagan O'Dorleg, Dominic DeAngelis, Dawn Swan, Darla, Crystal Edwards, Ash Loves Books, Alfredo Sandoval, and Adeline. Our lead archivists, Xavier Rangel, Wynne Lewis, Vaniel, Tyler Michael, Tracy Torello, The Original Deer, Sad Gail Callie, Ridiculous, Old Soul Like Mine, Plague Doctor Is In, Emmy Bartley, Melissa Harrison, Lord William, London Grace, Creepy Candy, Brian Baker, Amy Stubblefield, Alex O'Neill, Alex Goldberg, and 1000th Ghost. And our very generous Grand Overseers, Morning Rain 2619, Leah Carmella, Katie, Harrison the Overlord, Bad Diddley, Agent 355, and Queen of Flatulence. And of course, thank you to all my junior archivists, my YouTube members, and of course you, for making it to the end of the episode. Until next time, my friends, pleasant dreams.